Hello, I'm Sophia, and this is The World Unpacked. Today, we're unpacking the war effort in Ukraine. After months of gridlock, last week President Joe Biden signed into law the long-awaited foreign aid package that Congress had finally passed days earlier. This massive package includes aid to Israel and Taiwan and $60.8 billion for Ukraine. But after months of delay for the Ukrainians fighting Russian aggression, how much has been lost in the waiting? What will be the effects on the battlefield? And how are Ukraine, Russia, and Ukraine's allies preparing for what is ahead? Joining the show today to unpack these issues is my colleague Dara Massicot, who is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program here at Carnegie. Dara, welcome to The World Unpacked.
Thanks so much for having me.
Dara, let's start in the US, and let's first unpack last week's foreign aid package. This has been months in the making. Can you just give us a summary of the whole supplemental saga and how it got resolved, and then how the Ukraine aid package works exactly?
So this was a saga. I think that's the right word to describe this. It's a process that took about 6 months from being introduced in the fall till approval around a week ago. And it's $61 billion for Ukraine. And in terms of what was the final factor that motivated movement at the end, I think it was spurred on just by how quickly the battlefield is deteriorating and the assessments from the intelligence community and some of our officers that things were looking really quite dire for Ukraine by June or July. And so I think that was probably part of what caused it to move so quickly at the final stages. In terms of breaking down the spending, so it's $61 billion, and not all of that is weapons that will go directly to Ukraine. It's chopped up in a few different ways, around $13 billion for aid to Ukraine, $9 billion in forgivable loans to Ukraine, with the expectation that maybe one day they'll be forgiven. And then there's also a great deal of this budget that goes to replacing U.S. stockpiles for the equipment that we've already given to them. Some of this is wrapped up in the USAI initiative, and these are long-term contracts for Ukraine. So in some, there's weapons that will flow immediately to Ukraine. We've already seen that. And then there's also long-term contracts that will be built in for the next year or so. Okay.
So you've already said the situation in Ukraine is dire. What exactly is that $60.8 billion in aid going to change on the battlefield? You said it's already arriving, but how has this delay impacted the battlefield, impacted the deterioration that you speak about? And is this renewed assistance going to be enough to make a difference on the front lines?
Yeah, I think that's the important conversation to have in terms of what the $61 billion will do for Ukraine. It's going to be a measure that will get them probably through this year, maybe early into the next year, depending on how things happen in various Russian choices or offensives that happen. What it has cost, what the last 6 months of delays has cost, there's three parts of this. Ukraine is in the situation that it's in right now, not only from the delays of the weapons, that's being resolved as we speak. Things are flowing in, and they flowed in quickly once it was approved. There's a second issue of manpower, and that's the urgent need for more manpower at the front. Some of these units are under strength by 30, 40% or even greater. That's a domestic decision in Kyiv. And third factor is the fortifications that they're building, and they're building them quickly, but it started a little too late, and now they're trying to make up for lost time while they're being attacked. In terms of what we're seeing right now, as part of this first $1 billion relief effort, it's mostly focusing on artillery rounds for the units in the front. They are replenishing air defense interceptors to protect Ukrainian skies, protect Ukrainian frontline positions where they can. And then there's also embedded within this $1 billion tranche up front, there are plans to provide them with additional armored vehicle capabilities that they need to replace equipment that's been broken or lost from the counteroffensive last year.
Okay, so I really like this distinction that you make in your writing between what Ukraine needs: manpower, fortified defenses, and weapons. And I'd like to prompt you to speak a bit more to the challenges of manpower, mobilization, and fortifying defenses in Ukraine.
It is a serious issue for Kyiv. They are in a situation right now where there are not large numbers of men who are volunteering to fight, and women too. They're not volunteering to fight in large numbers. And I've seen estimates that the tally that they need to procure and quickly ranges anywhere from maybe 100,000 to a maximalist projection that you've seen from some former officials up to 500,000. This is going to take a major mobilization push, and not just the mechanisms that they've instituted very recently, which is dropping the age requirement to 25 from 27. That gets you a little bit. The issue is not that there are not available men in Ukraine. It's just how much political capital are they going to expend to get them.
Another challenge that you've outlined in your writing is the need for Ukrainians to fortify their defenses. How would you assess progress that has been made on that front?
They're moving quickly now, but I probably would back up a little bit in time. Russia started constructing their own lines of fortifications in the fall of 2022, and they're called in the West and in Russia in some quarters the Surovikin lines. And they're very difficult and challenging for the Ukrainians to get through. Ukraine really didn't start a similar process until last year, after the counteroffensive had failed. And they probably should, if you could wave a wand, they probably should have thought about doing the same thing when they saw the Russians doing it. And I don't know the reasons for that. I can speculate that maybe if the energy and the focus was on pushing forward in a counteroffensive and making progress in liberating territory, that I don't know if it was a political decision. It seems like a political decision to not want to build that line in the ground, because that is basically saying, like, these are where the stalemate lines are. Nevertheless, they have realized that this is really critically important, and they're putting a lot of effort into it. Their system is different from the Russian system. Russians have continuous trench networks and multiple layers deep and all sorts of traps. The Ukrainians do not a line, but more like fortified positions. And so that it's a little more flexible, and they can move from back and forth to the other. That might be a way for them to get around some of their manpower challenges, because if you build a line, you have to man the whole line. So that's what they're doing. They're marshaling civilian assets as well to try to help them with this. They're building it on the Russian border. They're building multiple layers behind the front line. The challenge is, right now, the Russians are pushing them, and they're having to fall back, and those lines are not ready yet. They're not built. They're not providing the soldiers with the protection that they need in some cases. So it's you don't want to do this while you're being attacked, but unfortunately, that's what they're doing.
So we've talked a bit about the U.S. and Ukraine. I wanted to spend a little bit of time unpacking what we know about Russia's strategy in Ukraine right now. And where do you see the Russian war effort when it comes to mobilization, defense industrial capacity? How would you assess their strengths, their challenges?
While all this has been going on, Russia has been applying pressure along the entire front line to try to exhaust those units while this political process was spiraling here in D.C. Now, within the last month or two, we're really seeing them focus on the Donetsk region in particular. It's the situation there. I've described it as not a stable one. The Russians are applying air power. Their reconnaissance strike is getting more effective at longer and longer distances. And they're advancing, not particularly rapidly, but every day it's kilometers and kilometers and kilometers, and the Ukrainians are having to give up positions. I suspect some of that will slow down once these artillery rounds make their way to the front line, and the Ukrainians can repel those armored assaults in particular. They don't really have a good solution yet for the Russian Air Force, who's launching glide bombs at them. That's still a bit of a challenge, even I think if some of the SAM stockpiles are replenished.
Can you just, for our audiences, explain the effects that these bombs are currently having in Ukraine?
Yes. So glide bombs are, they are not a precision guided munition, but they are a dumb bomb that Russia has configured to be slightly more accurate. They are launched from Russia's tactical fighter jets. These are like your flankers, Frogfoot. And they're very dangerous for the Ukrainians because they can't intercept the aircraft. They're launching them from 40 to 60 kilometers behind the line of contact, and that's well out of range of the air defense systems that Ukraine has. So what Russia does, this is a tactic that they're experimenting with, and they've done it a few times, where if they have a city that they want to destroy, or a village or a settlement, They will attack it with glide bombs for months, and they're very dangerous. They can, depending on which one, they can drop an apartment building if it hits it just completely. It's just a lot of power. And they'll ruin a place, and then they will surge forward reserve units who are not highly trained. They take a lot of casualties, but they wear down Ukrainian defenders. And when they're worn down and they're running low or they're trying to do a rotation, then they put in closing units or strike units to engage with them. They've done this now at Avdiivka. They honed it a little bit in Bakhmut. Now they're working on it again. I think there's also a conversation about, is Russia going to launch a new offensive? And the Ukrainians are anticipating a big summer offensive, and everyone's wanting to know, where is it? When will it begin? And if I was making a guess right now, based on the force posture, it seems like it's Donetsk, and Gerasimov and the Russian high command has orders. I want all of that territory, and that's what they've been throwing assets at it at great cost to themselves. There's also a higher risk that they are accumulating a force somewhere inside Russia to come down again from the northeast into Kharkiv. And they're shelling the city every day now and launching missiles at it too. I haven't been able to detect where that force is. If it's even being made, we might be seeing the offensive starting right now.
I want to come back to your sense of where the war is going. But first, since you follow Russian domestic politics very closely, let me ask you about a story that is in the news right now, which is the arrest last week of Russian Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov on corruption charges. What does that tell us about the standing of Russian senior defense officials with the Kremlin, and what does it mean for Ukraine?
I know that your listeners will be shocked to know that the Russian Deputy Defense Minister in charge of military contracts and for rebuilding the ruined city of Mariupol is implicated in corruption schemes. This is a very interesting case because Timur Ivanov has been living well beyond his means in the open for many years. Alexei Navalny's group has done a really interesting look into his finances, and it's available. But everything from Parisian apartments to the finest clothes, nice cars, nice vacations. It's all been out in the open, and very powerful people in the Kremlin and the defense ministry are at the parties with him. They know this. Mm-hmm. Corruption isn't what brought him down.
So why now?
That's the story. That's the interesting story. Is who did he cross? What business interest did he not give the appropriate cut to? There's some sort of informal rule that he broke, and he crossed someone that was very powerful. That's one side of it. The other interesting signaling to me, I think there's a second piece of this. He was arrested at the Russian military headquarters in Moscow. They arrested him there. They perp walked him out of the building. And the next day, he had to stand trial in the court at his arraignment. And he's wearing his full Russian uniform. He's wearing the full uniform. And there was no, hey, maybe take off your jacket, or why don't you do this in civilian clothes? He was in the uniform, and I thought that was a very, very interesting signal. And I'm speculating here, this is pure speculation, but that it seems like this is another instance of potentially tensions between the military and the Russian intelligence services, FSB in particular. And so the implication of it is he's far from the only one who is receiving lucrative financial benefits from their positions. And Defense Minister Shoigu also receives those benefits, as do his family members. So it's almost like a warning to him too. And he's very close to President Putin. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in Moscow. We'll see where it goes.
Okay, well, we might have to have you back on to discuss intrigues in Moscow. We're first going to take a short break now, and in the second half of the show, we will look at what comes next now that aid is on its way to Ukraine. Carnegie has just released Barbecue Earth, a great new podcast miniseries exploring the intersection of meat, climate change, and geopolitics. Produced and narrated by Carnegie podcast producer Hyewon Park and Noah Gordon, Carnegie's acting co-director of the Sustainability, Climate and Geopolitics program, The 6-part series looks at farmers' revolts in the Netherlands, cattle laundering in Brazil, lab-grown meat in San Francisco, the United Nations' reluctance to talk about what meat production does to the planet, and more. I found it a great listen and hope you will too. Find it wherever you find podcasts.
Hi, I'm Annalise Riles, professor of law at Northwestern University, anthropologist, and host of Everyday Ambassador, a new podcast that peels back the curtains of high-stakes diplomacy and gives everyone backstage access to the most powerful methods of leadership. On each episode, we'll break things down into deceptively simple moves that everyone can make to help build a more peaceful and sustainable world. So join me and become an everyday ambassador on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen.
So we have seen this war develop into a war of attrition, grinding on both sides. But at the same time, as you've already said, it's not a stable stalemate. It's a dynamic situation with both sides racing to arm. What trajectory do you expect the war to take in the months ahead?
I think that Russia is going to try to advance as far as they can before the full weight of these weapons arrive to the front line. This is their time. This is their moment from their perspective, as it has been for the last 5 or 6 months. And even with all their advantages in the sky and on the ground, they're still not able to advance very quickly. One, it's because the Ukrainians are quite knowledgeable about how to defend, but there's also many problems still resident within the Russian military in terms of how it performs, and they're using mass and just repetitive attacks in some cases. In other cases, they're adapting, and we're seeing them do things that make a lot of sense for where they're at right now. In terms of how far this goes, I think the first inflection point for them will be if they do reach this intermediate objective of the boundaries of Donetsk. They will have to take stock of how much did we lose for this, and do we want, we being the Kremlin, do we want to make an advance into Kharkiv? There's talk that they want to create something called a sanitary zone, and this is, in the Russian telling, a limited invasion of the region in order to, quote, stop the shelling of Russian territory. I mean, that's what they're saying. I mean, this is the talking points that they're talking about. I think for them to try to attack a large city like Kharkiv head on is well beyond their grasp. They didn't attempt this in the beginning of the invasion, and I don't think they have the manpower, the capabilities to do it now. The concern that I see is that they are making a deliberate point to attack that city with taking out heating, taking out water, taking out sewage, taking out TV towers if they can, and they're trying to make it an unlivable place so that people leave it. And that's something that you do in advance if you don't want to take it head on. So things that I'm looking at and colleagues are looking at is, are they in a place, and when would they be in that place to gather up the requisite equipment, personnel, and everything else for that kind of thing? And I don't think that that's on the horizon right now. I think Donetsk is the...
So in that context, I hear people often in the conversation around the upcoming NATO summit in July expecting some sort of significant Russian action around the time of that summit. Do you think that is a realistic scenario?
I think it's possible, because Russia likes to get headlines before these kind of events. It's possible. I think the first event coming up is May 9th, which is Victory Day in Russia. I think that's an important date to keep in mind. I don't know necessarily what Russia has up its sleeve right now, but again, there's talk of them wanting to call another mobilization. That's something that certainly would grab headlines. I don't think operationally they need to do that. They have enough volunteers coming in right now, and they're building reserves for what they're doing. If they did call another mobilization, it's because that they're choosing to open up another front from Russia. And that would be problematic in a few months down the road. Something else that they could do, there could be concentrated strike campaigns. We've seen them do that in advance of these sort of summits or while they're going on to try to get headlines back. So it's a possibility, unfortunately.
Okay, so you're obviously deeply involved in following events in the region, but you're, like me, based in DC. And so I want to ask you about your sense of U.S. strategy for Ukraine. When does this supplemental run out? Should we expect to see a repeat of the stalled decision-making on aid for the next package? Is package after package the strategy here, or what else are you hearing?
Well, so in terms of timelines, the timelines that have been said by the White House, I think are appropriate, which is this will last through the end of this year. It's really important that this supplemental is used appropriately. And there has been some talk that maybe this could be used for Ukraine to start another large counteroffensive. And I don't think that they have that capacity right now from a manpower perspective. And I'm not sure what the strategy would be in the shape that they're in right now. This supplemental is designed to stabilize the line. And I think that is most of the tenor of the conversations that I'm hearing. Is that this is to stabilize. This is to grind down Russian assaults because they haven't stopped. They haven't given up on how far they want to move forward. And when they're on the march, when they're moving, and Ukraine is supplied, they can inflict a lot of damage on them. So I think that's the strategy for this year. And our colleague Mike Kaufman and I and Rob Lee, we've written on what Ukraine can do and what Ukraine's partners can do for the long term. And it would require another supplemental into next year for anything like a renewed counteroffensive in 2025 or 26.
Okay, so I really want to get you to speak a little bit more to that point of Ukraine's partners beyond the US even, speaking as a European, there's so much speculation happening right now in Europe about the upcoming US elections and what a Trump victory might mean for Ukraine and European security. And to me, the wake-up call really should have been the month's delay around this supplemental for Europe. I mean, for months, Europeans heard when they came to town or when Americans came to Europe, any day now, we're going to pass this aid package. And rather than trying to fill in the gaps, many have waited instead to see what the U.S. would do if the U.S. would come through. It has in the end, but, at what cost? So what could they have done more? What can they do in the months ahead as the U.S. is entering election season and will be looking inward?
Well, I think there's parts of Europe that have been really forward-leaning. In this interim, I want to shout out the Czechia. They started their initiative to find artillery rounds from third parties who may not want to be seen as selling directly to Ukraine or selling directly to the United States. Instead, they're a waypoint in the middle. So that I think that was an example of leadership recognizing a problem and then doing something about it. That's potentially a very significant amount of artillery shells if they actually end up flowing. I don't know when they are scheduled to arrive. They said it would be now, but there's still some delay. Rheinmetall is another European company, I think, that's been very forward-leaning on trying to expand capacity. It can't make up for the loss if the United States is no longer doing this, but it means that there is a source of production so that if something like that did happen, it wouldn't fall away completely to Ukraine. It wouldn't. What Europe can provide Ukraine right now is not enough even for sustainment, but it's not nothing. So I think that's important. Other things, if this is important for Europe to keep going for the long term, in case the United States, for whatever reason, is no longer able to do this, there's different ways that they could take the training program underneath their umbrella, like a European-run training group. They could move the Defense Contact Group under their control in the European Union, perhaps. But there's ways. Some of the functions will be lost. A lot of the military aid would be lost, but there are methods.
Okay. And then coming back to the NATO summit, but this time from a NATO allied perspective, now that the supplemental has passed, is there anything more significant that you expect to come out of this summit for Ukraine?
Well, I just read something this week that I think they're trying to remove as many administrative barriers for Ukraine to join as an ally when the time comes. But for Russia, it's not, I don't think that deters them. I think that's something that we're doing to reassure the alliance and have a talking point, but I don't think that it changes calculus Moscow.
This is a very serious conversation. I'm glad that we had you on. I'm sure you will come on again. Final question to you is there a book or a paper that you recommend our audiences read to learn more about what is happening in Russia and Ukraine?
I would like to recommend, I haven't read it myself yet, but I know it's going to be great, is Michael Kimmage's has a new book out called Collisions. And if you've ever read Michael's writing, he has just such a intricate and very lovely way of writing. And it talks about how we got here and, this conveyor belt that all sides have been on that have led to this collision. So I highly recommend it just for his writing alone. But he's great.
It's at the top of my book mountain next to my bed also. So, well, Dara, it was a real pleasure to have you on the World Unpacked, and we look forward to having you back on the show in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, Mira Varghese produces the show, and Clarissa Guerrero is our executive producer. I'm Sophia Besch. Thanks for listening.